Okay, welcome to our cellular respiration video. Once again, I want you to take note on this video. You could use those notes later on in the cellular respiration quiz. And since this is a video, you could pause it, rewind it at any time. And if you're having any trouble understanding a concept, please pause it and look up some additional resources, either online or talk to your table partner to help you understand what we were talking about. So while you're watching this video, I want you to focus on the essential question, which is, how do the products of photosynthesis allow us to live? And if you remember, the products of photosynthesis are going to be glucose and oxygen. So let's jump into it. Cellular respiration, let's break that phrase down. So cellular is just going to be within the cell or at the cellular level, and respiration, you guys kind of already know what it is. You could equate it to breathing. So cellular respiration is kind of going to be like our cells breathing. So when you breathe in oxygen and you breathe out carbon dioxide. This happens within our cells also. So within our cells, oxygen will be diffusing into the cell, and carbon dioxide will be diffusing out of the cell. And that happens because of cellular respiration. So just real quick, going over this picture, you can see this person here is breathing in oxygen. And that oxygen goes down into the lungs. The oxygen then diffuses into the blood system. The heart pumps the blood throughout the body, and the blood, or the oxygen in the blood, finds a cell. So here's an animal cell, it could be inside of you, and that oxygen will diffuse into the cell. It'll find a mitochondria in that cell. You also eat some glucose. So there's a nice picture of a pie. You're eating some sort of sugar. That sugar finds its way to the same cell, into the mitochondria, and that glucose and oxygen undergo a chemical reaction to produce energy. It produces ATP. That's our energy molecule. Right, so before we jump into that, let's quickly review what photosynthesis is. And this is important because cellular respiration is pretty much possible because of photosynthesis. In fact, if you look at the chemical equation here for photosynthesis, cellular respiration is the direct opposite. So once again, photosynthesis is when carbon dioxide and water enter a plant or another organism that has chloroplasts, and it uses the energy from the sun to produce glucose and oxygen. So once again, this all happens inside of my chloroplast if I'm a plant or some other photosynthetic organism. And you need to know this formula. You need to know that 6 carbon dioxides plus 6 waters plus the energy for the sun produces glucose and 6 oxygen molecules, or 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O plus energy equals C6H12O6 and 6 oxygen molecules. Make sure you know that equation. Another thing we're going to quickly talk about is the difference between an autotroph and a heterotroph. So autotrophs are organisms that are able to produce their own energy or their own sugar. So they have chloroplasts. So this picture of a plant cell has 4 chloroplasts inside of it. Those chloroplasts undergo photosynthesis and make glucose. Now that glucose is then used by the mitochondria in that cell to produce energy in the form of ATP. The difference between an autotroph and a heterotroph is that heterotrophs, like you and me, have to eat to be able to get that glucose. So the glucose will enter our mitochondria, and that plus the oxygen that we breathe in is able to produce ATP. So autotrophs are able to produce their own glucose, and heterotrophs have to eat to get their glucose. Now the mitochondria are the key to cellular respiration. Just like chloroplasts do photosynthesis, mitochondria do cellular respiration. And if you saw in that previous video or previous slide, both plants and animals have mitochondria in it. So mitochondria are going to be present in all eukaryotic cells. They are not present in prokaryotic cells like bacteria. But this is where ATP is made. Right, so here's the chemical formula or the chemical equation for cellular respiration. So you can see that it is just the opposite of photosynthesis. I have glucose and oxygen as my reactants, and my products are going to be 6 carbon dioxide, 6 water molecules, and energy. The one change is that the energy is not sunlight energy, it is now ATP energy. So in this picture here, we have a we have a mitochondria, and what we have going in is the glucose that either the plant makes or we eat, the oxygen that is made by photosynthesis in the plant or that we breathe in, and what's going to be produced is water energy in the form of ATP and carbon dioxide. So it's just the opposite of photosynthesis. So I know this diagram looks complicated, and the process of cellular respiration is fairly complicated, but what I want you to understand are the 3 parts to cellular respiration. So in this picture here, I have a mitochondria, so this is going to represent a mitochondria. And this is all inside of a cell. So I just drew a cell membrane around the cell, got a mitochondria in it. And there are going to be 3 parts to cellular respiration. The first part is called glycolysis. Glycolysis happens just outside of my mitochondria in the cytoplasm. The second part is going to be the Krebs cycle, so that's the second part. And the third part is going to be the electron transport chain. Now you guys are a little bit familiar with the electron transport chain because it happens in the light-dependent reaction of photosynthesis. So the 3 parts are going to be glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. You can see from this picture that all 3 parts produce some ATP. So glycolysis will give me 2 ATP molecules. The Krebs cycle will give me 2 ATP molecules. And the electron transport chain will give me a whole bunch of ATP molecules, anywhere between 30 and maybe even up to 36 ATP molecules. So let's look at each one of these sections a little bit more closely. So glycolysis is that first part. And let's break that word down. So we're going to say glyco references glucose. So glyco is referencing glucose, and lysis means to split or to break. So glycolysis is just splitting or breaking of that glucose molecule. So it's cutting our glucose in half. So this is a really complicated series of reactions, and it happens with some different enzymes that are in here. What I want you to understand is that the glucose that you eat goes into your cells, and through this series of chemical reactions, that glucose is split into half into something called pyruvate. So glucose is turned into 2 pyruvate molecules, and what happens is I have a net gain of some ATP. So I produce 2 ATP molecules. The reason it's not 4 is because on the top here I have 2 ATP going in, I have 4 ATP going out, so These two cross each other out, and I have a total net of 2 energy molecules, 2 ATP. I also produce a couple of these things called NADH, which are electron carriers, very similar to that NADPH that you learned about with photosynthesis. So glycolysis is taking glucose and turning it into 2 pyruvate molecules. Now the second part is the Krebs cycle. So what happens in the Krebs cycle is those 2 pyruvate the 2 pyruvate molecules enter the mitochondria. That's an R, by the way. The 2 pyruvate molecules enter the mitochondria in the form of another type of molecule called 2-acetyl coenzyme A. And it undergoes this series of chemical reactions in this cycle, and it produces a couple of energy molecules. But more importantly, it produces these electron carriers, the NADH and the FADH2, otherwise known as NAD and FAD. So the Krebs cycle uses the pyruvate made during glycolysis, and it produces some electron carriers called NAD and FAD. And this is where my carbon dioxide is produced. Okay. Now that NAD and FAD that I made during the Krebs cycle goes into the electron transport chain. And this one looks really similar to the electron transport chain you saw in the light-dependent reaction of photosynthesis. But what happens is the electron carriers here, so it's carrying these electrons here, and this series of chemical reactions produce a concentration gradient. So it puts a whole bunch of these hydrogen ions on one side of this membrane and not a whole bunch on the other side. So I have a concentration gradient. I have a high concentration and I have a low concentration. So just like any diffusion, I'm going to move from high concentration to low concentration. So these hydrogen ions are going to start moving through this enzyme called ATP synthase. Every time it goes through there, I'm going to create ATP molecules. So you can see that this electron transport chain has the capability of making a whole bunch of energy. One thing I do want to point out is that this is where our oxygen shows up. So that oxygen that you breathe in is needed in the electron transport chain. So without this oxygen, none of this reaction happens and we don't produce all of that ATP. But what happens is that oxygen is what's called a final electron acceptor. So it grabs onto some of these hydrogen ions, and what is produced is going to be the water. So that's one of the products of cellular respiration, that water, and it comes out. So the electron transport chain, once again, is using those electron carriers, the NAD and the FAD, to produce a concentration gradient so that hydrogen ions can create a whole bunch of ATP. Now I know that was really complicated. If you're having trouble understanding it, just pause it, rewind it. You could read about it online, each separate part of cellular respiration. But here's a quick review of it. What you need to know is that there's 3 parts. There's glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. In glycolysis, I'm turning glucose into pyruvate. That pyruvate enters the mitochondria, goes through this Krebs cycle, and produces electron carriers, NADH and FADH2, that enter my electron transport chain. and allows me to produce a whole bunch of ATP. So glycolysis only produces 2 ATP, the Krebs cycle only produces 2 ATP, but the electron transport chain produces a whole bunch, anywhere between 30 to upwards of 34 to 36 ATP. So it produces most of my cellular energy. Now what I just talked about is aerobic respiration, which means that it happens with oxygen. You probably aware of that word aerobic, such as aerobic exercises where you're running or doing something where your heart rate is raised. Basically, aerobic means that it is with oxygen. I want to quickly talk about a second part, which is called anaerobic. So that word an means without. So this is without oxygen. So aerobic is where we have the electron transport chain. We produce all that ATP. Anaerobic respiration is without oxygen. So without oxygen, I can't undergo that Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. And I'm not going to produce very much ATP. I'm going to produce 2 ATP through glycolysis, but you can see here that I'm missing that Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. This happens when there's no oxygen available. Now you guys feel this all the time. So when you walk up the stairs coming to class and your legs start to burn a little bit, it means that those muscle cells in your legs are running out of oxygen. And instead of doing the electron transport chain, you have now entered aerobic respiration and you're producing something called lactic acid. That lactic acid is what makes your muscles burn. So when you're doing exercise or you're at the gym working out or you're on the football field and you feel that burn to your legs, your arms, it means that you're no longer undergoing aerobic respiration using that oxygen, and your body is really trying to make enough energy, enough ATP to stay useful, and it's undergoing the process of aerobic respiration and lactic acid is being produced. Now this happens in you guys because you guys are mammals and some bacteria. Now there's another type of anaerobic respiration that happens in yeast, and yeast are single-celled organisms. But what they do is they produce ethanol. Ethanol is alcohol. So this is why we use yeast to make some alcoholic beverages like beer. So we just take the oxygen away and the yeast will start fermenting alcohol in the form of ethanol, which hopefully you guys are not partaking in. So that is anaerobic respiration. And here's just a quick review of that chemical equation for cellular respiration. So I have glucose plus oxygen, and that makes energy with some byproducts of carbon dioxide and water. So a plant makes that glucose through photosynthesis, makes the oxygen through photosynthesis. Now plants are lucky enough that they have both chloroplasts and mitochondria in their cells. So those two things can go directly to the mitochondria to make the energy the plant needs. Whereas in humans, we have to eat the glucose. We have to breathe in the oxygen molecules, and it's going to be 6 separate oxygen molecules. That oxygen goes to one of my cells, enters the cell, enters the mitochondria, and produces my energy, my ATP. It also produces a byproduct of carbon dioxide, which I breathe out, and water. So the chemical equation for cellular respiration is C6H12O6 plus 6 O2 results in 6 CO2, 6 H2O, and energy molecules in the form of ATP. So I know that was a lot of information. If you are confused on any of this, feel free to come to me with questions. Hopefully you took some good notes. You could use those notes on the upcoming cellular respiration quiz. So thanks for listening.